I stood outside the house that used to be mine, watching through the living room window as my sister tucked my children into the bed I once slept in the house I once called home. The porch light I had chosen years ago still glowed above me, warm and familiar, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. 6 months earlier, I was buried in a small cemetery just outside of town, in a white casket my mother-in-law picked out herself. Friends came, neighbors came. My own sister sobbed so hard at the funeral that 2 people had to hold her up. What none of them knew, standing there in their black coats and their quiet grief, was that I was watching from the very back row, wearing sunglasses, breathing, alive. Nobody looks twice at a stranger at a funeral. Grief makes people blind to almost everything except their own pain. I learned that the hard way, standing behind a crowd of people who loved me, listening to them cry over a coffin that did not hold my body. I heard my husband's voice crack when he spoke about me. I heard my mother-in-law thank the pastor for such a beautiful service. And I heard my sister, my own sister, whisper words to my husband that no grieving sibling should ever have reason to say. That whisper is where this story truly begins, though it would take me months to understand what it meant. This is the story of how my own family buried me to bury the truth about what they had done. It is the story of a marriage rebuilt on the lie of my death, a sister who stepped into my life so completely that even my children stopped asking questions, and a mother-in-law who orchestrated all of it with the calm, practiced hands of someone who had done far worse before. It took one nurse, one small, unguarded whisper in a hospital hallway to unravel everything they had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how I ended up standing outside my own funeral, alive and unseen, you first need to understand the people at the center of this story. My name is Elena. My husband's name was Marcus. My sister's name was Renata. And the woman who held every thread of this story in her hands, quietly pulling each one exactly where she wanted it to go, was my mother-in-law, Vivian. For most of my marriage, I believed Vivian merely disliked me the way some mothers dislike any woman who takes their son's attention away from them. I never imagined she was capable of what she actually did. I never imagined any of them were. There are questions at the heart of this story that I still ask myself, even now, long after the truth came out. Why would a mother go so far as to fake her own daughter-in-law's death, rather than simply accept a divorce or a separation like any normal family disagreement? Did my husband know I was alive the entire time Renata wore my ring and slept in my bed? Or was he as deceived as everyone else standing at that funeral? And what exactly did a hospital nurse see, hear, or read in my file that made her risk everything to tell me the truth? By the end of this story, you will understand not just what happened to me, but how easily an entire family, an entire town, can be convinced that a living woman is nothing more than a memory. Marcus and I met the ordinary way 2 people meet in a small town, through mutual friends at a summer barbecue where neither of us expected to fall in love. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered small details about your day that you had mentioned only once in passing. I fell for him slowly, over months, not in one dramatic moment but in 100 small ones. We married 2 years later in a modest ceremony that Vivian insisted on planning almost entirely herself, down to the flowers and the seating chart. At the time, I told myself it was simply a mother wanting to be involved in her only son's wedding. I did not yet understand that Vivian's need for control extended far beyond flowers and seating arrangements. She wanted control over everything that touched her son's life, and for years, I was one of those things. There was a particular afternoon, nearly a year before any of this began, that I now recognize as a warning I failed to read correctly. Vivian invited me to lunch alone, without Marcus, an invitation she had never extended before in 3 years of marriage. She spent most of the meal asking careful, pointed questions about my family, about my sister's finances, about whether Renata had ever expressed interest in settling down or starting a family of her own. At the time, I assumed it was simple curiosity, the kind mothers-in-law display when they are trying to understand the family they have married into. I answered honestly, freely, never once suspecting that every detail I shared was being filed away for later use. Vivian thanked me for lunch, told me I was a wonderful addition to the family, and paid the bill before I could offer. I drove home that evening feeling closer to her than I ever had before. I did not know I had just handed her a map. Renata was 3 years younger than me, the sister who had always lived slightly in my shadow growing up, though never bitterly, or so I believed. She was maid of honor at my wedding. She babysat my children when Marcus and I needed a night away. She sent me flowers when I lost my first pregnancy, and sat with me for hours afterward, saying nothing, simply holding my hand while I cried. I trusted her the way you trust someone you have known since before you could walk. Looking back now, I search those years for warning signs, some flicker of resentment or hunger in her expression that I might have missed. I have found none. Whatever changed in Renata did not begin with jealousy. It began somewhere else entirely, somewhere I would not understand until much later. Vivian, however, was different from the beginning, and if I am honest with myself, I noticed it long before I admitted it. She was polished, precise, the kind of woman who never raised her voice because she never needed to. People did what Vivian wanted because disappointing her felt unthinkable, even to grown adults who owed her nothing. She ran a small but profitable chain of medical supply companies across 3 counties, and everyone who worked for her described the same thing, an iron calm that made you nervous in a way you could not quite explain. I told myself for years that her coldness toward me was simply overprotectiveness, a mother's natural wariness of the woman who married her son. I did not yet know that Vivian's business connections ran deep into hospitals and private care facilities across the region, connections that would later make everything that happened to me possible. My pregnancy with my second child was difficult from the start, plagued by complications that kept me in and out of doctors' offices for months. Marcus grew distant during this time, though I attributed it to stress and worry rather than anything more troubling. Vivian, strangely, grew closer, inserting herself into my prenatal appointments, recommending specialists, insisting I see doctors who, I would later learn, had long-standing relationships with her company. At the time, it felt like kindness. It felt like a mother-in-law finally softening toward me. I had no way of knowing that every doctor she recommended, every specialist she insisted I see, was another thread in a plan that had already begun taking shape long before I ever suspected a single thing was wrong. The accident happened on a rain-soaked evening in late October, on a stretch of highway I had driven 1,000 times without incident. I was 7 months pregnant, driving home from a doctor's appointment that Vivian herself had scheduled, at a clinic nearly 40 minutes outside of town, farther than any of my previous appointments had ever been. I remember the headlights of an oncoming truck, the sudden swerve, the sound of metal folding in on itself, and then nothing. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital room I did not recognize, in a bed with restraints I did not understand, surrounded by machines whose purpose I could only guess at. A nurse told me my baby had survived. She told me very little else. For the first several days, I assumed I was simply in the regional hospital, recovering under normal circumstances. It was only when I asked to see Marcus, and was told he had already been informed of the full extent of my condition, that something in me began to feel wrong. I asked what that meant. No one answered clearly. I asked for a phone. I was told my hands were too weak to hold one, though I could feel my fingers move perfectly well beneath the sheets. I asked for a mirror. That request, too, quietly disappeared, deflected by a nurse who suddenly needed to check my vitals, or adjust my medication, or attend to some other task that always seemed to interrupt the conversation at exactly the wrong moment. Days blurred into each other inside that room, marked only by the changing shifts of nurses and the slow, deliberate rhythm of medication schedules I had no power to question. I began noticing small cruelties disguised as routine care, moments where my requests were met with a practiced kind of gentleness that somehow always resulted in silence rather than answers. A nurse would smile warmly while adjusting my IV, and simply not respond when I asked what day it was. Another would compliment my resilience, while quietly redirecting the conversation the moment I mentioned my husband's name. I began to understand, slowly and with growing dread, that this was not simply a hospital being cautious with a fragile patient. This was a system, quiet and well-rehearsed, designed specifically to keep me exactly where I was, disoriented and unheard, for as long as someone else required. What I did not know, lying in that bed convinced I was simply healing from a terrible accident, was that Vivian had already begun making arrangements. She had told Marcus, and everyone else who would listen, that my injuries were catastrophic, that I would likely never wake, and that if I did, I would not be the woman he married. She spoke of brain damage, of a body kept alive by machines with no real hope of recovery. She used words like peaceful and release in conversations with my husband that I would only learn about much later, and while I lay in that facility, sedated more heavily than my actual injuries required, my family gathered 3 miles away to bury an empty casket and to grieve a woman who was, at that very moment, simply waiting for someone to bring her a phone. The facility I woke up in, I would later learn, was not a regional trauma hospital at all, but a small private care center that Vivian's company partially funded, tucked away in a town most people in our county had never heard of. For nearly 3 weeks, I existed in a strange fog of sedation and half-truths, never quite alert enough to demand real answers, never quite unconscious enough to stop noticing the small inconsistencies piling up around me. Nurses spoke to each other in hushed tones whenever I stirred. My chart, glimpsed once when a clipboard was left too close to my bed, listed a name that was not my own. I told myself I had misread it. I did not yet want to believe what my instincts were already screaming at me. The turning point came from a nurse named Patricia, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and the kind of exhausted honesty that comes from working too many years in a system she no longer fully trusted. She had been assigned to my care for 2 consecutive shifts, and on the second night, when the facility was quiet and the other staff had gone, she sat beside my bed and asked me, very quietly, if I understood what had really happened to me. I told her I did not. She looked toward the door before she spoke again, and told me that my family believed I was gone, that a funeral had already taken place, and that the woman listed as my emergency contact on my file was no longer my husband's wife in name only, but in every practical sense that mattered. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay awake replaying every strange interaction of the past 3 weeks, every deflected question, every conversation that had ended too conveniently. Patricia returned the following evening with something more concrete. A printed visitor's log showing that Vivian had visited the facility 11 times in 3 weeks, far more than any relative simply checking on a comatose patient would need to. She also showed me a form, one I did not remember signing, transferring certain medical decisions to Vivian directly, my own signature forged with a precision that made my stomach turn. Patricia told me she had seen families do difficult things during hard times, but she had never seen anything quite like this. A woman burying a living daughter-in-law, simply to clear the path for another marriage entirely. Patricia took a considerable risk in helping me the way she did, and I have never forgotten it. She told me once, during a quiet moment near the end of a night shift, that she had lost her own sister years earlier to a slow illness, and that something about my situation had unsettled her from the very first night she was assigned to my care. She said she had seen families struggle with grief in every form imaginable, but she had never seen a family so calm, so composed, so untouched by the supposed tragedy unfolding around them. That calmness, she told me, was what first made her suspicious, long before she found any actual proof. Grief, she said, is rarely quiet. What she saw in Vivian's visits was not grief at all, but management, the careful handling of a problem rather than the mourning of a loss. In the days that followed, I began to understand just how carefully Vivian had chosen this facility in the first place. It was not affiliated with any hospital network that Marcus or my own family would recognize, and its ownership structure ran through 3 separate holding companies before eventually connecting back to Vivian's medical supply business. Patricia explained that most of the staff had no idea of the connection at all. They simply followed instructions passed down through a chain of supervisors who answered, ultimately, to people Vivian trusted completely. It was not a conspiracy built on dozens of co-conspirators, but something far more efficient, a handful of key people in the right positions, each unaware of how their small piece fit into the larger picture Vivian had constructed around my supposed death. Armed with what Patricia had shown me, I began quietly gathering everything I could without alerting the staff who reported directly to Vivian's people. I requested my own medical records under a technicality Patricia helped me find, citing patient rights that even a facility like this could not fully ignore. The records confirmed what I feared, that my injuries, while serious, had never been life-threatening in the way Vivian described to my family. I had been kept sedated well beyond medical necessity, my recovery deliberately slowed, my awareness deliberately dulled, for exactly as long as it took for a funeral to be planned, a burial to take place, and a new arrangement to settle into what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary grieving family moving forward together. Once I understood the full scope of what had been done to me, my first instinct was rage directed entirely at Renata. I imagined her seizing the opportunity the moment Vivian presented it, stepping into my life, my home, my marriage, with the eagerness of someone who had waited years for exactly this chance. I built that story in my mind during my final days at the facility, certain that my own sister had betrayed me as deliberately and as coldly as Vivian had. It was Patricia, in one of our last conversations before my discharge, who gently suggested I might be wrong about at least part of what I believed, and that I should not confront anyone, until I had seen every piece of the truth for myself. She was right to caution me. When I finally left that facility and began quietly investigating from a distance, staying with a cousin 2 counties away who Vivian did not know still spoke to me, I discovered documents suggesting Renata had been told a story entirely different from the truth. Vivian had convinced her, over months, that my condition was permanent and irreversible, that machines alone kept my body functioning, while my mind had already gone somewhere no one could reach. She told Renata that Marcus needed someone to help raise the children, that I would have wanted exactly this, that stepping in was an act of love rather than betrayal. Renata married Marcus 8 months after my funeral, believing, as much as anyone can believe a lie told by someone they trust completely, that she was honoring my memory rather than replacing me. I spent one particularly difficult evening at my cousin's house reading through old messages between Renata and myself, searching for any sign I had missed, any indication that she had known more than she let on. Instead, I found the opposite. Message after message showed a woman grieving genuinely, asking Vivian repeated, anxious questions about my condition, asking whether there was any chance at all that I might recover. Vivian's responses, which Renata had saved and which I later obtained, were masterworks of manipulation, warm in tone, devastating in content, always closing the door on hope just gently enough that Renata never thought to question the diagnosis herself. Reading those messages, my anger at my sister quietly transformed into something closer to grief on her behalf, for the version of herself that had been so thoroughly deceived. Final piece of the twist came when I obtained financial records showing what Vivian had actually gained from all of this. Her son's marriage to Renata consolidated family assets, medical practices, and property holdings that had been split between my side of the family and Marcus's since before our wedding. My supposed death eliminated my legal claim to any of it, while Renata's marriage to Marcus kept everything neatly inside Vivian's control. This had never been about protecting her son from a wife she disliked. It had been about money, property, and power, disguised so completely as maternal devotion that even Marcus, I would come to believe, never fully understood the mechanics of what his own mother had orchestrated around him. Marcus opened it. I watched every certainty drain from his face in the space of a single second, replaced by something between disbelief and a kind of grief I had never seen in him before. Grief for the version of events he had trusted completely, now collapsing in front of him. Renata came to the door moments later, took one look at me standing very much alive on the porch, and dropped the dish towel she was holding without a single word. For a long moment, none of us moved. I remember the sound of rain starting against the porch roof, the same sound that had been playing the night of my accident, though I did not make that connection until much later. Marcus reached toward me and then stopped, his hand hovering in the air, as though he could not decide whether I was real enough to touch. It was Renata who moved first, crossing the doorway and pulling me into an embrace so tight it nearly knocked the breath from me, repeating my name over and over, as though saying it enough times might undo the 8 months she believed I had been gone. Whatever anger I had carried on the drive back to that house dissolved somewhere in that embrace, replaced by the exhausting, complicated relief of being seen again by people who had genuinely mourned me, even if their mourning had been built on someone else's lie. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom confrontation, though the legal proceedings came later and lasted the better part of a year. What followed first was simply the 4 of us, eventually, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had once hosted holiday dinners, untangling a lie that had taken months to build and only minutes to destroy. Renata wept in a way I had never seen from her before, not for herself, but for the 8 months she had spent believing she was honoring a dying sister's memory rather than stealing a living one's life. Marcus said almost nothing at all, staring at his mother with an expression that told me he was, for the first time, truly seeing her. Vivian alone did not cry, did not apologize, did not offer any explanation beyond a cold assertion that everything she had done was necessary to protect this family from what she called my instability, a diagnosis no doctor had ever actually given me. She was eventually charged with fraud, forgery, and several related offenses that carried real legal weight, though nothing could fully capture in a courtroom what she had actually taken from all of us. My marriage to Marcus did not survive what had happened, not because I blamed him fully, but because trust, once buried this deeply, proves difficult to properly resurrect. Renata and I are speaking again, slowly, carefully, two sisters relearning how to trust each other after one of us was lied to so completely that she nearly built her entire future on someone else's grave. If someone you loved did something unthinkable while believing they were protecting you, would you find a way to forgive them, or would you become a stranger to them instead? What do you think you would have done in Renata's position, believing so completely that a sister you loved was gone, and that stepping into her life was an act of love rather than betrayal? And what do you think finally made Vivian believe she could get away with something this large, for this long? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this story kept you watching until the very end, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. Because trust me, there are more stories like this one still to tell.